Good evening. Get all the buttons pushed up here first of all, and then we'll go from there. We have been talking about the final week of Jesus's life, and tonight we are still on the third day. We'll be looking at the third day for a couple of weeks. You may recall that last week there were two groups that we spent most of our time talking about, and that was the Pharisees and the Herodians. The Pharisees were religious leaders. The Herodians were more of a political group. They both were seizing on an opportunity to limit or to cut off Jesus, for lack of a better way of saying it. And the debated question was centered around coins and taxes. Who should you be focused on? Who should you be paying to? And Jesus responded by telling them to what? Do we remember? Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and then to God what was God. You may recall that the last verse that we looked at, I think it was Mark chapter 12 and verse 17. How did the people respond to Jesus? How did the people, I guess respond is the right word, to what Jesus said? Do you remember the word that was used? They marveled, amazed, whatever word you want to use there would be fitting for them. So we're going to see tonight another group that we occasionally talk about, we occasionally reference, and that is the Sadducees, okay? So we had the Pharisees and the Herodians last week, and we have the Sadducees that we'll be looking at here tonight. So just a few things about the Sadducees to start with. Like the Pharisees, they were a religious group of Jewish people. Even today, the Jewish religion, that's a broad description. We sometimes use the word Jewish, and it's, everybody goes into the pile. Well, maybe, but there are sects and there are divisions within Judaism, just like there really are any religion. Just because the overarching banner has some similarities, what's underneath might be quite different. By the New Testament time, the Sadducees were sort of a mix of both. There was a sort of political / religious part to them, in part because they were willing compromisers with the Roman authorities. And we'll explain why here as we go along. By cooperating with Rome, they were then allowed to control what was called the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Council or court consisting of 71 members. Have we heard of the Sanhedrin before? All right. Maybe we've heard of it. Perhaps not. It's not going to play a huge role here, but just know that for the sake of what we're talking about this evening, this sort of cooperation, it's kind of I scratch your back, you scratch mine kind of a thing for them. But they, as we quite often see back then, even as we see today, sometimes people like a little bit of power, and sometimes working together, one side gets a little something from it, maybe another side gains from that as well. And so the Sadducees, you will hear in the scriptures, or you will read in the scriptures more about the Pharisees than you do the Sadducees. The Pharisees are a much more prominent, I guess, or maybe more referenced group in the scriptures than are the Sadducees. Let's talk a little bit about the Sanhedrin, though. This word, Sanhedrin, sort of by definition, I guess, or the translation means sitting together. And that's why they used it as a title for this group. This is a picture, supposedly a picture of the Sanhedrin. The picture's from like the 1700s, so I'm not sure if it's accurate or not. But as you can see in the picture, there are a whole bunch of people doing what? Sitting together, right? And this is where you would have had discussions or conversations or whatever it might would be. I use the word president here just because I think it's relevant for us. But the head of the Sanhedrin was the high priest. And we've talked quite often about the high priest. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about on Sunday night, I believe it was, we talked about Hannah and Eli being the high priest when Hannah went in there. This high priest was a prominent position. Luke will name Annas and Caiaphas as high priest when John the Baptist began preaching, and then shortly thereafter when Jesus begins his earthly ministry. Probably two names that you maybe have heard. Annas, maybe not as much as Caiaphas. We see Caiaphas' name a little bit more when talked about Jesus. But Annas was the high priest from 6 to 15 AD, which makes sense because that's Jesus as like a youth in, and that's we sort of lose Jesus in the scriptures for a little while. His influence continued as 5 of his sons, a grandson, and his son-in-law Caiaphas all serve as high priests. And so you can see here that this job of high priest, it gets a little bit generational there, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily, but it does get a little bit generational. We can relate to that. You know, people that are politicians, for instance, and their father was a politician and their grandfather was. That stuff sort of, sometimes those power positions like that will trickle down a bit as well. Caiaphas was the actual high priest from 18 to 36 AD and presided over the Sanhedrin during Jesus's ministry there. Questions about that? We've got a little bit more, but yes. There you go. Hopefully you've learned. I hope you learned more than that, but I guess if y'all call somebody tonight and tell them y'all want to go up to Dairy Queen and Sanhedrin together, I don't know if it works. I don't know if it works the same way right there, but whatever works for you. Tell them you learned a vocabulary word tonight. A little bit about the Sadducees. This may not show up very well. I should have used a different color. The Sadducees, though, as we said, they were less numerous than were the Pharisees, but they were wealthy, aristocratic, extremely influential due to their high political and religious spots. And so they're this sort of the higher class, if you want to use that word right there. However, like we might sometimes call the higher class at times, Josephus, this is writing after Jesus' life, 100 years or so afterwards, described them as, this is a direct quote, all right, which is a word you may be familiar with. They were rude and ill-mannered. I'm sure if I told you, think about it for a minute, do you know anybody that you've come across in life that is rude and ill-mannered? All right. We probably all know somebody. Hope it ain't you. All right. Everybody didn't turn and point at the same person, so that's good. But if somebody is rude and ill-mannered, that sort of sticks with you, right? Like that's not a positive trait, but it's a trait that will stick with you. He is, obviously we're painting with a broad brush here, but he's describing the whole group as rude and ill-mannered, but maybe because of this smaller amount of people, but this position that they had, you can kind of be that way because you weren't really threatened from any side. Go ahead. Sure, I'm sure. And a lot of times, even today, we run across people that maybe have that entitled attitude that we would describe it the same way. The Jewish-Roman wars break out about 30 years after the death of Jesus. And with that, we see the Sadducees sort of decline. And eventually, once the city of Jerusalem was gone, the temple and the city was gone, the Sadducees sort of disappear from history as well. So we lose the Sadducees as this goes forward. A couple things about the Sadducees, and some of you may be familiar with this, but just I say fundamental doctrines. This is a very, very sort of simplistic description of Sadducees' beliefs. I want us to be careful, though, because when we talk about beliefs of people, especially when I do something like this, not every single person's beliefs match up 100%. Okay, there are conflicts and there are disagreements and there are things that we sometimes maybe, oh, I'm 100% with you on that, but I'm maybe not 100% there. So know that when I say something like this, I'm painting sort of broadly, just like Josephus did, with boorish and rude and ill-tempered. But fundamental doctrine of the Sadducees was denial of life after death. Okay, that's the most basic building block, if you would, of the doctrine of the Sadducees. And so when we say life after death, we're talking about some sort of punishment, some sort of reward, some sort of future state when this life is over that you would move on to something else. And so that's a basic fundamental doctrine. They were the priestly party, and they were put a lot of emphasis on ceremonial law and sacrifices. And as we see, and Jesus talks about this in the New Testament quite often, we see that sometimes this ceremonial law, this sacrifice, it became almost a show a lot of times. That there was sometimes that did. We saw the Pharisees, they put a lot of emphasis on the law, right? It was the law. But Ben talked about that, I think, last week, when that law sort of melded into tradition. And in many cases, the law sort of got left behind and the tradition got pushed forward. So you have two different groups right here. Last thing here is they put a great emphasis on the 5 books of the law, but they rejected those oral traditions that we see with the Pharisees. So we clearly have two different groups right here. Do I have something else? Yeah, I do. All right, before we go any further, any questions or comments on anything so far? Okay, probably depends on who you ask, right? There were more Pharisees than Sadducees. So they kind of held different spots within. It seems to me like there's maybe more of a political power on the Sadducee side, maybe a more religious power on the Pharisee side. So I don't know. Measuring something as even would be difficult to say. Ben, did you have something?
Paul used that, smart as he is, he used that to say it was bacon or something. He would say, hey, they're after me because of the resurrection.
Right.
The Pharisees didn't believe in that, so then the Pharisees would start arguing.
Okay, get on. A way to slip out the back door sometimes. Yes, sir.
Did these Sadducees and Pharisees, did they just, are those man-made sects of the Jewish law? It's not in the Bible.
No, we don't see anything like that. And these are terms. I guess I could have looked up what Pharisee and Sadducee mean, but these are groups that emerge over time. When Moses is given the law, when they come out of Egypt and Moses is given the law, this is Judaism, right? But it doesn't take long for people to start branching. What triggers? That's what that's Leviticus and Numbers. It's a long time until Sadducees in the New Testament. And so, tell me what happened today, and then 2,000 years from now, and tell me, or 4,000 years from now, tell me if it changes any. It'll change over time. So, man-made. I don't know that anybody sat down and said we're going to be the Pharisees, but things sort of emerge like that over time. Mary. Oh, sure. 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 Yes, sir.
I read once that some of it developed because they debated the law, which is what everybody's saying, the opinions.
Sure. Sure. You all are most of you are probably familiar with Cane Ridge up in just outside of Lexington in Bourbon County. And people in the Church of Christ will talk about how Cane Ridge was an important part in the development of the Restoration. The people in the Christian church will make the same reference. And the Baptist church will reference that. And the Presbyterian church will reference that. All of these different groups will make references to that place. And you say, well, how can it be? Well, you had people that came together from all sorts of places, and they found people that in many ways they agreed with, in a lot of ways they disagreed with. And they sort of branched. And, so like Mary was saying there a minute ago, there is this sort of human nature to sort of pair up with a group that you maybe agree more with and depart from another one. And I'm sure that's the Pharisee, Sadducee, like you said, Don, with these, if they were debating and discussing it, people said, well, I think I like that better than I like that. And I go to this side. Ben? Sure. Right.
Top of the Jews.
Right.
And people do the same thing with titles. Most reverend and
sure.
Holy, this, that, want to elevate themselves, but God says, don't do that.
Right.
Call no man on this earth.
Absolutely. A little bit further. And by the way, these are, I will claim, I don't know that I will, I'm assuming this is historically accurate. This was the type of dress, the thing that I came across, that the Sadducees would have worn. I'm assuming, I don't know if you wore this all the time, but this was the type of dress that would have been worn in the Sanhedrin. So you get a sense of maybe what these would have dressed like. We see here, though, although they were leaders of the Jews, they held office, high priest, controlling the Sanhedrin. They said they don't have any pretenses. That's what I read as I was preparing for this. They weren't really spiritual or religious, if that makes sense. They were sort of disinterested, maybe, in serving God, but God was sort of there as they had their power, and so they maybe had a little bit of claim to that in the process. They were more materialistic, and they kind of liked that security that they had under the protection of the Roman government. As long as they stayed on this good side of Rome, then they got to be in charge of the Sanhedrin, and that gave them power then over the Jewish people there in Palestine as well. All right. Any other questions about any of that? There's probably a lot more study that has been done, and probably a lot more study that can be done about the different groups as well. But tonight, our focus is going to be on the question that the Sadducees will ask of Jesus. So if you want, go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 22. That's where we're going to spend most of our time, is in Matthew, and we'll see a few other things in Mark as well. Yes?
I don't know that it's a group of people, but there's a lot of people in the world that serve God disinterested.
Uh-huh.
They want God whatever trouble comes.
Sure.
And that's serving. And I think that's a sad state. Like these people, they're not serving God with any interest or any desire. And that's, God will not accept that. And I think that a lot of people in the world today are going down that same path.
Sure.
Serve God as long as you can handle the out stuff.
Right.
Well.
Right.
Or maybe when somebody's really sick, the rest of the time I'm not really.
Mary? Sure. Don, did you have something? Oh, okay. All right. So last week we see the Pharisees question Jesus. I asked you all about that a minute ago, about the coin and the response that was given. And so tonight we're going to see then the Sadducees follow up with a question regarding resurrection. And the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. Didn't really, and not so much. Sometimes people talk about that. They say they didn't believe in the resurrection. And I think sometimes people think about that as Jesus's resurrection. But really what that means is there was no belief that there was any life after the fact. So it's a resurrection of whatever you were. That was kind of the belief, that death was the end of it. Okay. But they don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. So their purpose here is probably the same thing that every other group was. How can we get Jesus to say something dumb, say something that's wrong, maybe say something that's against the law? We'll be able to ridicule him. People will see that he is wrong and crazy and stupid, and they'll remove themselves from him. Of course, Jesus will then point out their error. So the motivation of the Sadducees here is quite simply the same motivation that the Pharisees and the Herodians were. They're just going about it with a slightly different method. All right, so let's start with Matthew chapter 22, and we'll read verses 23 through 28 right here. Matthew 22, 23 through 28. Annette, do you care to read this for us, please, dear? Okay. Now, before we go any further, what the first part of that should sound real similar to what Josh read just a few moments ago from Numbers chapter 27. Okay, you say, okay, I think I heard that just a minute ago up front. Well, that's what it is. So no words in red right here. This is the question. We'll come back to the question here in just a second. Matthew 22, verses 29 to 33. You'll notice this is all red. Words in red are Jesus speaking. And so let's see how Jesus responds to the question presented to him. Tom, do you care to read this one? All right. So let's look at a couple of questions here, and we'll get to all of that here in just a second. So stay with me. We'll try not to jump ahead on anything. But just the first question, I know we've already talked about it, but what was the Sadducees' belief on life after death? Didn't believe it. Okay. So it's an interesting line of questioning that they're presenting for somebody who does not believe that there's any life after death. And so when I said at the beginning, it was almost like it would be an attempt to ridicule. Think about something that, if somebody didn't believe in, but then they immediately ask a whole bunch of questions, kind of semantic questions, or maybe almost like, pointed questions about it. You have to almost question their motivation here. Are we really trying to learn, or am I trying to get you like in a trap? Josh? Sure. And we see some similarities in it right this. Okay. So the question that they bring up, it's referencing what we just saw just a moment ago. But what did Moses said should be done when a man died, leaving a wife but no children? Matthew 22 and verse 24. Yeah, it says, so if you look at verse 24, Moses said that a man dies having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up the offspring from his brother. Now, this is a direct quote, right? This is quite literally what Josh just read, Numbers chapter 27. And we see there, the second part, it required that if a man died without children, his brother was to marry the widow. Firstborn son of the marriage would receive the inheritance. This was all designed to preserve the inheritance of the family, which was a huge thing then, and in many places still is a huge thing. And so they asked this question: what had Moses said to be done when a man dies, leaving his wife, but no children? And he poses that question. All right, let's go a little further. In the question asked by the Sadducees, how many brothers were there? 7. Okay. So this is almost extending this question sort of extemporaneously. This is almost like in a joking extension. All right. Because it would make sense that if a man died, then there would be a brother. But it's almost like they're taking this to the biggest extreme that they possibly could and said there's 7 brothers in this. What happened to the first brother? All right. He died. Was he married? Yes. Did he have kids? Okay. Did not. What about the second, the third, all the way down to the 7th? Same thing happened, right? Well, first of all, this is probably not a realistic thing to happen. But they're asking a question, and realistically, when they're asking this question, you're probably like, well, that could never happen, right? That's the answer they're expecting. Well, that'll never happen. That's not really something that's going to happen. What eventually, though, happens to the woman? She dies as well. So they are stretching this all the way down. So they give you the story, the backstory. Man, married, no children, dead. Marries the brother, second, dead. Marries third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. Then she dies as well. Matthew 22 and verse 28. What question did they actually ask? So when the resurrection comes, they don't believe in it. But when the resurrection comes, whose wife should she be? It's a pretty tough question, right? I mean, how would you answer that? First, all right. Is that last? that's where it is. Somewhere in the middle. I don't know. I'm her eighth old man. I'm Henry the eighth. I am. Is that? I don't know. Maybe not the exact same, but nonetheless, it's a question that seems like it'd be hard to answer. Was she legally married to all of them? All right, maybe so. Does first or second or third matter in this case? The spouse had died. I don't know. It feels like a hard question to have to answer right there. Now, I'd have probably thrown my hands up and said, I don't know, you figure it out. But that's not the way that we see Jesus respond. Interestingly enough, Jesus, it says, we see Jesus rebukes them, right? What does it mean to rebuke? Yeah, kind of fuss that right there. That makes a stern correction, maybe a term would be. But he rebukes them with three statements. Let's look at Matthew chapter 22 and verse 29, because I'm not sure. Let's see. Yeah. So first of all, Matthew chapter 22 and verse 29. The first statement Jesus says, you are what? You are mistaken. Okay. So he starts by saying, you are mistaken. In a sense, make sense to me today. What's he telling them? Don't know the scripture. You are approaching this from the wrong perspective. You've got this entirely wrong. Now, Don, what he said there, you do not know what? You don't know the scriptures. Now, they quoted the scripture, right? Didn't they? I mean, they, quite like we said, they read exactly what Josh read just a minute ago. They said, teacher. Started that with Jesus. They called him teacher, and they said, Moses has said. They didn't quote anybody. They said Moses, the lawgiver. Here's what it is. Jesus said, you don't know the scriptures. The third thing, he said, you also do not know what? The power of God. See, this is a group of people that held power. This is a group of people, the Sadducees, that held a tremendous amount of power over the Jewish people. They ruled the Sanhedrin. They probably had as much power as any Jewish person did at the time. But he said, you have no concept of the power of God. Verse 30. What does Jesus say regarding the resurrection? So let's look at verse 30 right there. I heard it from three different people right there. In the resurrection, they do not what? They don't marry. They're not given in what? He said, but instead, they're akin to what? Angels of God in heaven. Interesting comment right here, right? But if this is accurate, what does that do to the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh husband? Kind of negates the whole question of that, right? It's a mute point. Because think about this for a second. The law that Moses presents dealt with inheritance where? On earth. It didn't deal with inheritance in heaven, but it dealt with inheritance on earth. See, I can't inherit heaven from my father or my grandfather. My father and grandfather can teach me to become a Christian, but I don't become a person who has a spot in heaven just because of who my parent was. That was hard for the Sadducees to grasp, because who were the Sadducees? Who was the high priest right there? Remember the example we gave? Annas, Caiaphas, son, grandson, passed on. They couldn't grasp this concept, because these people are thinking about inheritance as something that you get where? Right here. That's not what heaven would be. If that was the case, some of us wouldn't have a hope of making it. What if heaven for you relied on your parents? Well, I'd much rather it rely on me, because I can't control anything that my parents do or maybe did in the past, and now they're gone, and I would be suffering as a result. Okay? That is what Jesus presents to them. Thoughts on that before we go any further?
Well, that just goes to show that that's the difference in reading something and studying.
Agreed. Other thoughts?
See it kind of played out in tomorrow in the Old Testament. One died, and the other one died. And I don't want my other son to die. And I brought all that situation up. We see it played out there, but this is, we've got to get our minds wrapped around that we have no idea what our minds are going to be like.
Yes.
We talked about Sunday about not whether we're not how that's going to. We can't comprehend
Right.
what it's going to be like, or
right.
what it's going to be. So, you're trying to do so, you'll worry yourself.
They are. Go ahead, Josh. Go ahead.
And two, I've heard people say, well, we'll be like angels. They use this to say that we'll be like an angel having wings.
Sure.
And that's not what that's
No.
saying. That's saying angels in heaven are not good. So that's another
I agree.
Reading, but not studying.
They're not sensual. Yeah. Right.
So when he says they'll be married, they're not given in marriage, those are the kind of things, good or bad, that bring trials and difficulties, right? Marriage, and those are, and if heaven is supposed to be this perfect place where nothing happens, or where nothing bad would happen, well, I can't relate to that on earth, right? Because marriage is difficult, marriage is challenged, bad things happen within that. Family members, or in-law family members pass away. Those are people that I would not be connected to if I wasn't married, but that's something troubling or bad that might happen as well. We think about those kinds of things. Those are the on earth problems that we are trying to not have when we go to heaven. And so if we take those kind of issues with us, what if the Sadducees question was asked? What if Jesus said, she's the fourth husband? That's who it'd be. Well, they're all dead, but now 6 of them are mad, right? You've invited a problem going forward. Let's go to Exodus right here. This is Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Dad, you care to read this? And it's 2 slides.
And Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the back of the hill and came to Horeb, which was God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of the bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush was not burned. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. Here I am. And he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God.
Jesus recites that last verse in Matthew 23 and verse 32. He says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And so, question there. And so, what do you think? What does God mean by that statement? First of all, that's not really what my question is. But what does God mean in the statement to Moses? And then what does Jesus mean when he says that to the Sadducees? God of the living. Mary? He's a constant. Very good.
And Jesus was there. Jesus is the one that made the speech to Moses. And now he's making it to them too. It's like, I've always been.
Right.
I am. No beginning, no end. I've always been.
Right. Other thoughts?
And if Moses and all of them were dead, then how could he still be the God? How could Jesus then, or God then, say, I am the God of these people who are dead?
Right.
Jesus is trying to emphasize to people that there is a big difference in physical and spiritual. And that's hard for us even today to grasp that. We can't hardly grasp. I can't imagine being in heaven not being married to them.
Right.
Or you not being my son.
Sure.
My daughter. Can't imagine that. But I know it's real. And I know it's be perfect.
Right.
And that's why Jesus says you hate your wife, you hate your mom, you hate your... Because Christianity has to be the very most important thing. Heaven has to be the most important thing for anybody, okay? Whether you live long or you live short, it makes no difference. God is the God of the living, and heaven will be perfect, and that's what we have to strive for.
That's what we see right there, Matthew 22 and verse 32, that God is not the God of the what, but of the, not the God of the dead, but of the living. How do people react to what they see here? Look at verse 33. So how does that word use compare to the word last week? They were marveling last week, right? They were astonished. I think that's the last one. They were astonished this week. So you've got two conversation pieces that have been presented, two efforts to do what to Jesus? To embarrass him, to draw ridicule, to say, like we said at the beginning, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. This guy's foolish. You know, a smart person's going to quit this guy and come back over to, the Pharisees or to the Sadducees. But Jesus explains, sort of points out, first of all, in both cases, sort of points out the fact that they were approaching this all wrong. Approaching it all wrong, but instead, and they had, as Josh said, they had knowledge maybe, but not understanding. Is that the right way to describe it? That's it. So closing thoughts on that. Boom. Yes. Right. Now, I do want to say this because I was thinking about this in preparing, and I didn't know exactly how it was going to come up, and I'm going to present that. I'll present this to you. Could the question that the Sadducees asked have been a legitimate question? Or let me rephrase it. Could somebody have asked that question with legitimacy? It is a legitimate question. I think it's a question that we would maybe consider, like you were saying today, because like you said, it's hard for us to sort of fathom, I'm married to this person here, but not there. Josh.
I almost want to say it's kind of a facetious question in a sense because they don't believe in the resurrection, so they don't believe in life after death. So for them, if they don't believe in it, to me that'd be
no. But what I'm saying is, like, could somebody have asked that question with a pure heart and, like, genuinely, I would like to know the answer to this question?
We asked that just last week in our Bible class.
What was it?
About what it's going to be like in heaven. Will we know each other and stuff like that?
Sunday morning. I wasn't in here. That's going to say. I got you. Right. Sure. Done.
A lot of things in the Bible are emphasized by the repetitive nature of it. So they were taught, they didn't believe, but he was telling them he wasn't the God of the dead.
Right. Right. Yes, ma'am.
To me, this whole thing is they were trying to apply a logic of human mind.
Yes.
And there is none. Where Christ is trying to say, you've got to accept by faith what I'm telling you, because it's not logical. It's beyond anything you can understand. So you can come up with scenarios all day, and you won't find an answer.
Absolutely.
It is God's way.
Absolutely.
It's just about it.
Mary.
He really made my point. Like, I have asked this question in my own life. When I was 21, a law school, the person that I love the most had made my vows to. And in my young human mind, I wondered this. Like, I'm feel like I'm going to, end up all in the middle school, but you don't know. And I look at this in the same, with the exact same question. What does this look like? And I just had not put this together. But it was a very honest question.
Yeah, sure.
It was a real question. It's exactly right. You're thinking of it in human mind. That's just not
Right.
And that's what we're all looking at. That's the limitation we're in.
I like where you use the word logic there, because quite frankly, logic and faith do not go hand in hand, because faith would defy logic, because logically we're going to write it down, we're going to make notes, we're going to draw, and we're going to connect, and we're going to say, okay, well, this makes sense, and then this makes, but faith, you sort of supersedes all of that, and you can't, I can't make the math work. And I been reading something about the moon landing, and they're talking about all the math that went into everything with that. but they were working nonstop on that. And I'm just thinking, like, I would have been fired in the first 10 minutes. Like, where's the 2 + 2 at on here? But they had to make something work for them that seemed almost illogical as well. But we have faith that what we are doing is going to work out. But those questions, like we said there, this is a legitimate question because this is an earthly problem that we all, in some form or fashion, may have to deal with. One of you was going to say something, Dad.
Beloved, now we are children of God. We got that. And it's not yet been revealed what we shall be. But we know that when He, Jesus, is revealed, we shall be like Him, for we shall see Him. At that point, we shall be just like Jesus. We will be sons, brothers, joint heirs with Christ in heaven. That's impossible for us to comprehend right now. But we will see and we'll be just like Him.
Sure.
Just as He knows things, we will know. We will know.
And to piggyback a little bit on what Boo said right there, those are statements but vague. You know, and if I were to ask you, what do you think a person in heaven would look like? Draw that for me. I mean, I guess you could, but I'd probably get 25 different pictures. And if we weren't careful, we'd look at it and say, well, Don, that's a terrible picture. There's no way it'll look like that. People would fall out over those kinds of things. Yes, sir.
I think one of the most important scriptures that ought to keep us humble, it's not within our own direction, direct our own steps, etc. You know, and we'll just think of that when we're trying to figure some things out. That really helps me.
Right. And if we're not careful too, like you said,